This video is a follow-up to my video on camera settings for wedding photographers. I'm going to dive into the exposure triangle and what you really need to know when it comes to weddings. I first became a photographer because my husband, now business partner, was really in photography, and I got tired of waiting around for him to take photos on our backpacking trips, so I made him teach me. And what I really wanted to know as he was teaching me all this technical aspects of photography is, but when would I want a slow shutter speed? Or when would I want a high aperture? And so that's really what we're going to talk about today, is what you actually need to know. I'm not going to get super technical or overly nerdy about the camera settings. Instead, I'm going to focus on some important tips that will actually help you take better photos on the wedding day. So let's start there. Let's start with shutter speed. What do you actually need to know? When would you actually want to shoot a slow shutter speed? So we started photography as kind of a hobby on our backpacking trips. And when I would want a slow shutter speed would be when I'm photographing a waterfall and I want to capture that nice milky water. Or when I'm photographing the stars and I want to capture the star trails. Or when I just need a slow shutter speed for things like capturing the stars because I need that low light capability of my camera. And in order to do that, slower shutter helps. And so when you think about your wedding photography, ask yourself, when do I need a slow shutter? Or when might I want a slow shutter? And a lot of times you don't. A lot of times a slow shutter just means camera shake and motion blur and blurry images. And so unless you want blurry images, you're probably not looking for a slow shutter speed. And you're actually just looking for whatever shutter speed, the fastest shutter speed you can use and still get the appropriate amount of light into your camera. So a fast shutter speed is better because it's going to freeze the motion better. But sometimes you need a slower shutter speed to let more light into your camera so that you can get the ISO or the aperture that you want. And so in order to do that, you need to know the limitations. So let's talk about the limitations of shutter speed. If you want a sharp image and you're outside and the action is moving quickly, the faster the action is, the faster shutter speed you might want. So you might want 1/1000 for a couple walking down the aisle. You might feel okay with 1/500 for most of a ceremony. You might want to be really careful as you get to 1/200, especially if you're shooting with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Really, that 1/, whatever the focal length of your lens is a good, like, warning, there might be some camera shake if I don't shoot at a faster shutter speed. So knowing those limitations of your shutter speed is good. Another limitation is synchronization with your flash. You need to know your flash sync speed because you might need to shoot your camera at somewhere around 1/200, 1/250 or lower in order for your camera to sync with your flash. So shutter speed has those limitations. There might be times creatively when you want a slower shutter speed, and so playing with those ideas and those concepts in your mind is really going to now make shutter speed something that you can use creatively rather than in a panic. So you might use a slow shutter speed to capture a crazy dance party, and you might use a combination of flash to freeze the motion with dragging the shutter to get some of that motion. You might be taking a portrait of your couple under the stars or a portrait of your couple in front of a waterfall, and then you want that slow shutter speed. You might want to capture movement, the twirling of a dress, and then you might want to intentionally use that slow shutter speed. So once you understand when you might use shutter speed, you can get more creative and use it in a creative way. Maybe you want to capture the crazy dance party, but the couple is standing still. There are really some fun ideas that you can use. So then let's talk about ISO, because that's an easy one. Similar to shutter speed, most of the time you don't want a high ISO because the higher your ISO, the less dynamic range you have, the lower your quality of your image is going to be, the more graininess you might get in that image. So you need to know your ISO limitations of your camera and know when does it start to lose dynamic range, when does it start to show a lot of graininess, and kind of have that in your mind so that you can know, hey, I'm starting to compromise this as I raise my ISO in order to be able to choose my shutter speed and aperture. Most of the time, otherwise, you can shoot within a certain range of ISO and have it not affect how your image looks as much. And so you're going to choose your ISO based on your light that you're dealing with, and in low light conditions, you'll be higher, and in high light conditions, you'll be lower. The best ISO is the lowest ISO you can have without compromising your shutter speed and aperture. In the same way that the best shutter speed you can have is the fastest shutter speed without compromising the light that you're getting from ISO and aperture. Aperture is the one where people are usually making more decisions. They're choosing, I want to shoot at a low f-stop number in order to have a shallow depth of field so that I can get that nice bokeh effect on this portrait. Or I want to make sure I'm shooting at a high enough aperture that everything in this photo is sharp. I want foreground, background, subject. I want everything to be nice and sharp. That might be for a landscape portrait, or that might be for a group photo where I need to make sure everybody in the group photo is sharp. So you might shoot at a higher aperture for that. As long as you can do so without having your shutter speed be too slow or your ISO be too high. So they all interplay together, and you have to make those decisions about what am I compromising in order to get that effect that I want. Another time you might use high aperture is if you want a cool sun flare from the sun versus that bokeh effect. And so there's creative ways that you can use aperture. Usually it's depth of field that's making your decision, or the light conditions that you're dealing with. In low light conditions, you're using that wide aperture, low f-stop number in order to make sure that you can keep your shutter speed fast enough. So for ISO, you want as much dynamic range as possible so that you have more flexibility in bringing back shadows or reducing highlights in your editing. In shutter speed, you usually want it as fast as possible so that you don't have to stress about motion blur or camera shake. And aperture will really depend on what your goal of the image is in terms of depth of field or in terms of what your lighting conditions are. Of course, there's exceptions to some of those rules, such as if you intentionally want to shoot at a slow shutter speed, or if you're just limited by the different variables. Once you start getting into those low light conditions, you'll have to decide what you're willing to compromise. Am I willing to shoot at a higher ISO and risk some of that dynamic range? Or am I willing to shoot at a slower shutter speed and risk that there might be some motion blur? Or can I get my aperture lower by finding a faster lens in my camera bag so that I don't have to make quite so many compromises? So as you can see, there's a lot of interplay between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. It's really deciding what's the limiting factor for the situation that you're in and what sacrifices are you willing to make. Once you know that, then you can start to get creative with it and find ways to explore new ways of taking a photograph. I hope that helps you understand what you really need to know when it comes to the exposure triangle, and you can move from knowing what your limitations are to knowing how you can do something more creative and kind of start to have fun with it.